Welcome to How to Trust Your Intuition, the podcast, the place where we learn that trust is earned and not given, even with ourselves. I'm your host, Betsy LaFay. I'm a social worker, turned award-winning psychic medium, turned intuition teacher. And my school, Trust Yourself Intuition School, celebrated its 10th anniversary in 2023. Join us each episode as we interview thought leaders and luminaries in every genre. They talk about how and when they learn to trust their intuition. Most say they're still learning. What happens when they do trust it and what happens when they don't. Stick around as we all walk together down the road towards trusting our intuition. Hello, and welcome back to another episode of How to Trust Your Intuition. Today's episode features my interview with Amy Green Smith. We had a ton of fun. We laughed so much. As you know, laughter is contagious. So if that is not reason enough to listen, one of my favorite type of people is the authentic type of person who follows through with their word. Now, I'm all for radical self-care and canceling if you need to take care of yourself and all of that, but someone who has impeccable communication. And all of these things describe Amy Green Smith. She actually is a communication expert and helps her clients find their voice. She's my people, as they say. Amy Green Smith is a certified and credentialed life coach, hypnotherapist, masterful speaker, and personal empowerment expert. Amy uses her role as a coach, writer, podcaster, and speaker to move individuals to a place of radical personal empowerment and self-worth. With an acute focus on helping people find their voice, she is highly sought after for her uncommon style of irreverence, wisdom, and humor, and has been a featured expert in Inspired Coach magazine and on Fox 5 San Diego. This episode, we get so much poignant advice about how to communicate with those around us, especially if you're sensitive, maybe you're an introvert, people pleaser. This episode is for you. I hope you love Amy Green Smith as much as I did. Well, without further ado, it is an honor and pleasure to introduce you to Amy Green Smith. Thank you for being on the show today.
Yay! I'm so excited to connect.
Yeah, so could you tell the audience a little bit about yourself?
Okay, well, I'm a Taurus. I don't think that's what you meant.
We're interested in it all.
I'm 4 on the Enneagram.
I'm a 4 too.
Are you as well? Yeah. For human design, I am a projector. I hardly ever start off that question that way, but for some reason I felt compelled to.
I love it.
And so, I work as a life coach and a hypnotherapist, and my specific focus is around finding your voice, but it really is sort of 2 major components. There's this internal element of genuinely believing in your own enoughness, your own self-worth, sort of that intrinsic value of a human. And then there's the external component of, okay, if I do believe in myself, then how do I actually communicate that with the outside world? What do boundaries look like? What does saying no look like? What do tough conversations? What's the anatomy of a tough conversation? So I really focus primarily on those 2 major portals. Like, how do we get you to a place where you genuinely think you're worthy or you're enough? And then semantics wise and logistics wise, how do you tell your mother-in-law to butt out of your fucking relationship? Or how do you tell your boss, like, I'm not going to be working, extended hours? Or, what is the actual verbiage for that? In fact, before we even hit record, you were saying, "Oh, I love how you said that specific phrase." That's what I'm talking about. Like all the things that we've never been told how to properly break up with somebody, or like have challenging conversations, boundaries, etc. So,
well, from what I gather from what you just said, it's like we're told if you're in a relationship you don't want to be in, break up, but we're not told the how. right? And we're told if you feel uncomfortable with your mother-in-law, stand up for yourself. But we're
Yes.
not told the how. And I think that's something that you and I are really in alignment with. I know for me, if I'm going through something and I don't know how to approach it, especially linguistically, I do so well with sentence stems, right? So
Yes.
I teach actually nonviolent communication. So when you, I feel, because, and putting in a request. And
Yes.
that's something for years coming from my psychology and social work background that I offer to other people as well. As like, okay, well, here is sort of an outline of what you can fill in. Just a couple months ago, my neighbor, she had to negotiate with her landlord, and what she was saying to me was way different than what she was saying to him, but she didn't realize it. And I was like, this is one of the things I do for a living. So if you type an email and you want to send it to me first,
Yes.
and it literally worked like a charm. I mean, she got what she wanted from the landlord like that, which was to get another person evicted, which is like super
Big
huge.
deal.
Yeah, and all I did was take the words she had been telling me and put them into the email. But I think we can all sort of at least somewhat resonate where she was trying to couch it in niceties. She was trying to act grateful and not entitled and all of that. But that can take us out of assertiveness.
Absolutely.
I really want to know. So I want to talk a little bit more about the connection between intuition and speaking up for yourself. But we'll take that in just a minute. But before we do that, when you came into this work, so I get you have an educational background, you have all of these things. For yourself personally, have you been somebody who came into this world that was just like, I'm this assertive and I can tell people how I feel, and I'm enough? Or did you have to have your own personal work to be like, oh, wow, I've walked through fire and now I can teach other people how to?
No, I was totally born with it.
Yeah, I love that laugh. I was like, I know where she's going. Like, I love it. I love it.
Does anyone ever I mean, that's
Maybe
the whole
narcissists, but that's completely false, right? So yeah.
Well, I want to say something about that a little bit. The concept around narcissism or toxicity with what you were talking about just a second ago, when we are told these things like go break up with them or quit that job or do whatever, but we're not really given the semantics for it. One of the other slippery slopes I think that all of us need to be really aware of is the enticing allure of calling somebody toxic, calling somebody a narcissist, labeling them, when what you're really saying is we have conflict and I'm not really willing to talk about it.
That issue is only going to get bigger. It's already going to get bigger. It's already trending, but it's only going to get bigger. Yeah.
And what you don't realize in those situations is when you are not speaking up or you are choosing to be the victim and just stand in that place of blame, essentially what you're saying is there's no way for me to be happy unless that person magically changes the story and they magically change. And so we do not have control over that, of course. So it now becomes, okay, if that's how that person operates, how does Amy need to show up in order to feel like I'm in a place of power? And I personally don't feel like all that powerful when I'm labeling people as toxic and narcissistic and all of these things instead of actually giving voice to things. So my suggestion to people is this: if it is worth complaining about, then it's worth taking action on.
Ooh. That's like my motto. That's why I don't like people complaining and they take personal responsibility. You summarized my life.
But that is different than emotional releases or an energy purge or venting or coming home and being like, this shit happened today. I just need to get this out of my body. Let me just verbally process. That is different than having a continued grievance with someone in your life that you speak up to other people about. Like your mom gets an earful about how shitty your best friend is, or your partner gets an earful about how shitty your coworker is, but you don't ever actually take up that grievance with the person who can do something about it, then that is on you.
Yeah.
So I operate from the belief of I need to at least give people the opportunity to be what I need. If they're not capable, if they're not willing, that's a different thing. But if I have not given them the opportunity to be what I need, that's on me. That's my issue. So as far as your question,
let me just say one more thing. Let me interrupt and say that a lot of times when people are sitting in that position of this person's a jerk, or this person's toxic, or this person's crossing my boundaries, you know, whether they're narcissistic, toxic or not, if you and I are friends and every Saturday you invite me over to your house and you provide bagels and coffee and everything, and I'm like, oh, this is awesome, I'm going to Amy's every Saturday, and then you never voice, you know, Betsy never offers to bring bagels, she never has me over to her house, I could be a narcissist or not.
Yes,
right?
Perfect example.
There's no way to know. You have to advocate for yourself. You have to go into those waters and say like, hey, you know, I really like these Saturdays, but let's talk about, you know, evening out the workload, or can we change it up? So I think that's really important. And to be a little bit, I don't think it's an oxymoron. I guess it's a little tongue in cheek, but I would label the behavior that you talked about, where you're complaining to everybody else but not addressing the issue or the person, I would call that toxic.
Absolutely.
Right? Yeah.
Absolutely.
So I just want to turn that in.
We get these little buzzwords, right? Like where we want to throw it out. Like Gen Z right now is everything is trauma. And I'm like, okay, just everybody just fucking calm down here for a second.
Yes.
But in that anecdote that you just shared, that is such a perfect example, because all we have to go off of is behavior and how we interpret the behavior. Unless something has been verbatim spelled out, when you do this, I have this emotion, here's the impact on me, and here's my very specific request. Unless we're doing that, all we're doing is inferring. And then we're also making connections like, wow, Betsy's behavior reminds me a shit ton of my mom, who I had to sacrifice all the time. And I was people pleasing and, you know, walking on eggshells. So in those situations, what I suggest to people is so the anatomy of actually broaching that conversation would be something like this: to ask for the time to talk, but then to also own your piece in the matter, which is just not saying anything until now. So the way it might show up or sound is, hey, Betsy, listen, I realize that I've been building up some resentment on my side about some stuff happening in our friendship that you would have no idea about. And I've realized that that is wildly unfair to you. And so I just, first of all, want to say, I'm sorry that I've been bothered by something and not brought it up to you. But then I'm also hoping that I can kind of share with you where that's coming from, right? So when you engage in a relationship like that and you start off with vulnerability, you are far more likely to elicit vulnerability from the other person. It's much harder to write you off, right? Than if you come in going like, we need to talk, you always, you never, blah, blah, blah. We have mirror neurons, right? In the brain, we are naturally going to mimic that other behavior. So if you want somebody to be soft, go in soft and own your shit. It's not that how you feel is wrong. It's the fact that you haven't spoken up about it before, or the way you've spoken up about it has been passive aggressive. It's been a joke. It's been yelling. It's been in a way you cannot be heard. So going into that conversation vulnerably and then saying, hey, listen, I should have told you this a long time ago. And that is really on me. And I want to say something because I value you, because I love you and I love our relationship. And then this is one of the slight nuances that I would talk about with communication tactics, is to say, hey, listen, here's the scenario. Here's what's going on. Obviously, every Saturday we get together, blah, 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 blah. here's how that lands for me, or here's how I interpret that, or
Yeah.
here's what I make up, instead of saying you, taking the ownership and saying, here's the interpretation on my end. What's happening for you over there? Because I'm making up a bunch of stories.
Yep. We see the
Right?
sun is coming down,
Yes, it's a
highlighting this whole
sign.
conversation. I'm gonna just intuitively ask her the highlights of this, but I feel really compelled to share. I have these two friends, they're a couple, and we went through one of these situations just recently, and it was so healing. So they had a situation where they wanted to foster some reconciliation between me and someone else in our community.
Okay.
And they're actually sort of like mediators in that way. They're healers. So they
Okay.
approached me with it. And honestly, and I said to them in this conversation, I was like, if there's anyone in my life that I would want to hold this space for me, it would be you two. So like, thank you. I feel honored that you're thinking of me. And then what happened was, for like an hour and a half, and in the very beginning, I said, but there's nothing to reconcile. There really is no, I don't need that person in my life. And that's it. I don't feel any rub. It's fine. But then for an hour and a half, they kept explaining why and explaining their process and saying like, are you sure? And when I came back actually, it was like the next day, I was like, I'd love to revisit this when we're like, because one of them was kind of like sick. I was like, once we have some time, let's revisit this. So I went back over, and what I realized was, and this is what I shared with them midway through our second conversation, was, first of all, I was on half my medication that I normally take because there's a shortage. And my medication actually helps me differentiate myself from other people. And it has to do with ADD, being on the autism spectrum, and then my past, difficult past with my family. Yeah. And I'm used to a lot of abusive coercion, not in the past 2 years, but that's been something for 40 years that I've been used to. And the way it happens is, are you sure you don't want an iPhone? Are you sure? iPhones are great. Are you really sure you don't want an iPhone? And then even out of survival, especially as a kid, I'm like, well, I guess I want an iPhone, like even if I don't. So I shared with them, and I was like, so because I love you guys and I trust you, I was continually asking them, like, what is it you're seeing that I'm not? Even though my boundary was solid. And again, I was a little bit foggy. And in the end, I said, I know you guys were not trying to be coercive, but that is in the end how it came off from me, that you were not mirroring back how I felt. I was mirroring back, oh, that's great. This is your process, this. And in the end, it was just like such a heartfelt apology from them. And really, they've done studies in attachment theory, right? That you can mess up like 70% of the time, but if you are doing the repair work and you're approaching and you're having these conversations, being like, oh, I stepped on your toes, like I'm really sorry. Next time, let's try to do this. That's what actually creates the solid relationship. So I definitely use my when you, I feel because, and we all felt so much closer afterwards.
Well, I think this is also such a great illustration of the connection between intuition and speaking up for yourself.
Yes, let's talk about that.
And so I think one of the biggest pieces that interrupts our ability to, first of all, listen to our intuition and then act on it with our words is our conditioning.
Yes.
And my situation, I grew up in a lot of heavily indoctrinated religion. And my father had a master's in divinity and a doctorate in ministry, so he wasn't fucking around. But, and it sounds like this is very similar for you and your family of origin and upbringing, is we are sort of grandmothered into a set of beliefs that we don't consent to.
Yeah.
And it's all completely subconscious. So especially if you have extreme religious dogma, or even an extremely patriarchal family that is rooted in religious dogma, even if it's indirect, those sorts of things can make it incredibly difficult to parse out what is God coming through and what is my fucking intuition and what is my own internal God. Like, this is what I call our divinity. And then what is man-made outside of me, answers coming from some other deity or supreme being. And I'm okay with having guidance and having various guides. I think those are gifts along our way, but the buck stops with me.
You're all ready for your vacation. It's really hectic getting here, but you're seated in your airplane seat, looking out the window, and you hear the pilot come on the intercom. Good day, everyone. It's a beautiful day outside, 71 and sunny. As you're aware, to get to where we're going, we need to fly over that mountain range, and sometimes there can be a little bit of turbulence. I'm about 80% sure we'll get there safely. So buckle up, relax, and enjoy your flight. I know that sounds like an absurd situation, but when I put this in context of trusting yourself and trusting your intuition, and I ask people on a scale of 1 to 10, 10 being the most, how much do you trust yourself? 8 is a very high score when asking people. So if you fall on a 2 to 4 range, you're totally not alone. Now picture this other scenario. You're out to lunch with a friend, and the friend says that they've been having a really difficult time learning French. You ask the logical question, are you taking a class? And their answer is, well, I'm taking Spanish. Guess what? If you want to trust yourself deeply, if you want to have an easier time making decisions, break through blocks, connect with people, know who to connect with, when, there's a class for that. I've actually helped thousands of people truly trust themselves in uncertainty, in times of doubt or fear, shame or guilt. And I have a free masterclass called Intuition 101, How to Trust Yourself in Uncertain Times, that will tell you everything you need to know in order to learn to trust yourself. The link is in the show notes. However, you can also go to howtotrustyourintuition.com, all spelled out.
Right? Like I'm the boss as far as the call that is going to be made. And that is one massive issue that I see a lot with my clients and students, is dismantling belief systems that they adopted without consent. Yep. Right? That I'm innately bad, or I'm broken, or I need saving, or this is a woman's role. I'm talking in, very gendered, specific language, but for those who identify as women or in a femme body, that like you have a specific station in life. And so disproportionately, it is already more difficult for us to speak up, because our culture is one in which we say if women speak up, they're bitchy, they're shrill, they're too masculine, they're all of these things. And I think that there's this massive pushback there of going, no, I can actually completely stand in my power. I can follow my intuition, and I don't have to be malicious. I don't have to be acrimonious, combative, vitriolic. I can actually just say, oh, I don't share that opinion. I hope you can understand. Right. And so I'd be curious from your perspective too, dismantling family trauma, family systems, especially rooted in any type of extreme religion. I describe it as intuition was being bred out of us. Like there's literal text in the Bible that says, lean not on your own understanding. I don't know how antithetical you have to get to listening to your intuition. Right. So without going down that whole route, I think there's the concept that really helped me own my own intuition and to continue to hone it is the idea that I've already been imbued with everything that I need, that when we're talking about divinity, when we're talking about a God essence, that's intuition. We already fucking have it. But then we do what I like to call the cognitive override, where we are like, yeah, but I should do this job because everybody in my family has, or I should marry this person because they look so good on paper, or everyone in my family loves them. Or instead of like genuinely listening, we do that cognitive override. But how the fuck would we know how to listen?
Right.
How would we know?
Because we talk to people who teach it.
That's right. And I say the same thing too, of like, I would have nothing to do all day if everyone knew how to speak up for themselves.
Yeah.
But how it relates to that speaking up element is exactly what you talked about here with this anecdote you shared. It was so strong in you that this wasn't the answer for you, that you were able to give voice to it. The intuition spoke, and then you spoke through your body.
Yep.
A lot of times the intuition is speaking, and then we do not speak through the body.
Absolutely. Taking all of these topics and bringing it back, and we don't have to spend a lot of time, or you can share deeply on it. My dad is a deacon in the Catholic Church.
Yes.
And I do consider that to be a cult. And my mother, who actually is the one who is the most mentally ill and in charge of the family. Regardless of that, she went to the same diaconate school, took the same classes, and so did all the other wives with their husbands, and only the husbands got ordained, because women can't be ordained in the Catholic Church. Right. So I just to illustrate that point. Yes. In your story, and I think this is what sort of stops a lot of people in vein of what you're talking about. Let's take an extreme situation that a lot of people have seen in the media. So let's say like Mormonism, for instance. Yes. If all of a sudden you wake up and you're like, this is not for me, this is not who I am, you have an extraordinarily real risk of losing everyone in your family. And in the rare case, there are a few people, whoever they may be, an aunt or a cousin, who is like, I'm going to stay in the church, but I still love and believe in you, and we can still connect. Like, it's very, very rare.
Right.
And so, again, that's an extreme situation, but I think even people who haven't been involved in extreme religion or cults, in air quotes, whatever that is, the fear is still the same, and the danger still might be the same. And so in your story, in your journey with, a religious father and all of that, did you fear speaking out, being yourself? And did they wind up supporting you in the end, or did they cut you off or anything like that?
Well, buckle up, Betsy, because this is a good one.
And on my seatbelt.
But this really comes back full circle to your very first question of, were you just born with all of this stuff, or did you learn it the hard way? The latter. Yeah. So I definitely would have. I was gregarious and outspoken, but I still was incredibly invested in the opinions of other people and how I was portrayed to them, or how it was perceived by them, which, by the way, when I'm talking about being a people pleaser, I'm not talking about somebody necessarily who's like meek and quiet and shy. I'm talking about somebody who's just genuinely invested in the opinions of other people so much that they will twist and contort in order to get that approval. That's perfectionists. That's approval addiction. That's people pleasing. That is also surviving sometimes.
Yes.
So there's a lot there. But so for a bit of context, I grew up in a extremely conservative, born again Christian family, very evangelical. I went to Christian schools all growing up, was immersed in Christian environments. So it was youth group on Wednesdays, and then also on Sundays, twice on Sundays. It was chapel on Fridays at school. It was Bible every single day. And I was a little bit of the child when they would talk about Abraham sacrificing Isaac, which if you don't know the story, it's a father being told by God to prove his trust, you need to sacrifice your child, which in my book is sociopathy, but
my eyes are like gigantic. Yeah.
Right. And so I was the one like raising my hand being like, excuse me, teacher, would you do that with your son? Like logically, this doesn't feel good. And so even at like 16, 17, I was like, I would follow this if I agreed with it, not just because it was given to me and it was not hierarchical in some way. No. If God says, go jump off a cliff, I need to agree with him that that's a good choice, not feeding an ego of a narcissistic sociopathic deity. So you can see that I'm still meet with therapists.
I like the fire. It's necessary.
Well, I also think anger is a completely warranted emotion around abuse. If you have suffered under abuse, being angry is completely warranted.
And it's a change maker, right? Without the anger, nothing's going to change.
That's right. So there were definitely what I like to call the pink flags. So instead of the intuition being the red flag, abort mission, there was lots of pink flags, and there were mauve, and there were kind of beige. There were like hints of these pinks, right? But again, I was taught that this was real, and any resistance to it was spiritual warfare, was Satan, right? So it creates a system in which questioning it is unacceptable. Like there's no way to act, like if we're talking about academia and like researching it, peer reviewed evidence, like no, none of that. It is blind faith, 100% blind faith. So a bit of context, I have two younger brothers. They for all intents and purposes, I was the good kid. I started working when I was 14. I put myself through college, got married young, moved out of the house. My brothers both chose not to go an academic route. No big deal. But they also had a lot of trouble with the law and did jail time. And so there was sort of a stark difference between the children of the family, right? And that'll play in a little bit here in the future. So in 2007, my father passed away. And I knew very, very concretely, because I had a background in makeup artistry, that I wanted to do the makeup on his dead body for his viewing, right?
Yeah.
We've reached the dead dad makeup portion of the show, everybody.
I just love you. I mean, I'll also interject, which but in many cultures, that's actually normal. It's normal to have the body in the house where all of the family members help dress and pet and hug and lay with and spend time with. So not in the evangelical born again Christian faith, I'm sure, but in many cultures around the world, that's a way to move through grief in a healthy way.
Absolutely. Yeah, we didn't get the memo over here. We did not get the memo. So I felt, because at the time I was working as a makeup artist and I had this skill set, I felt like I would be such a dick to be like, Dad, get your own makeup artist, when I could fully do it. And I also knew that I wanted to speak to the crowd of, hundreds of people who showed up for his service. So and that was an intuition like no other. I was like, no. And people were like, are you sure you're going to be okay? And I was like, back off me. I know what I want, and I'm doing his makeup. And so I did, but needless to say, I kind of felt like I was winning a daughter that day. I'm speaking to all these people, and not to mention that I have all of these people laying their hands on me and praying and all of this stuff that I don't subscribe to. So we get back home to my mom's house, and she finds it the most opportune time to tell me that she feels as though my father and her had failed as parents. I'm like,
great timing,
because I'm winning a daughter, and wow. And you're going to tell me that today, the day of my dad's funeral. And she said, because the three of you, grouping me in with my two younger brothers, the three of you are not walking with the Lord. And so I went, ooh, okay. And I said, well, I don't think you should say that to a child, is what I said. And she said, well, that's just how I feel. And I'll tell you what, Betsy, that was a pivotal moment. because I realized that speaking up for yourself, advocating for yourself is not always an ultimatum. In fact, it rarely is. However, there are situations when it is an ultimatum. And I realized, okay, up until now, if I had to choose between making you happy, making me happy, I would have picked them, the other person. And I went, you know what? If push comes to shove and I have to make that decision, I'm choosing me.
Yeah.
I'm choosing me, even if that means that this is going to get really uncomfortable with my mom, right? And it did. So the next kind of trajectory was very adversarial, very combative. It was like this floodgate opened and I wanted to fight about everything. I was like, let's bring up gay rights. Let's talk about abortion. Let's do, and it was like that veneer had just fallen off and I was ready to like really be who I was. And up until then, I had really shapeshifted. Whenever I was around my family, I kind of like, I was loud and sassy and stuff like that, but there was no agnostic, atheism, spirituality, witchcraft, none of that. We could not talk about any of that. So it wasn't until many, many situations where I had to clean up my delivery with my mom, not clean up my message.
Okay.
And this is what I think is so important, because a lot of times when we fly off the handle, introverts, I'm looking at you.
When I graduated with a BA in psychology in 2002, attachment work was only applied to children. Now, in 2023, it seems to be all the rage for a reason, because knowing your attachment type, there are three main types: avoidant, anxious, and secure, really changes your life. And if you listen to the podcast where I talked about how I lost $100,000 from a spiritual, quote unquote, spiritual coach, the silver lining to that experience was me discovering the root of a lot of my issues. I was anxiously attached. I had anxious attachment. At the very end of that terrible, terrible situation, yes, it was traumatic, I came across Maya Diamond's work. And it was working through her program that literally rewired my brain from anxious to secure. This is how I made it through all of my major transitions over the past 2 years and discovered so much about myself. Now, if you don't know about attachment work, don't feel bad. Here's a typical situation, in fact, the most common situation that happens with these attachment styles. Person A and person B are in a relationship. They care about one another. Person A reaches out to person B, doesn't hear back right away. So then maybe sends another text or another gesture, which further pushes person B away. Both people get resentful, and eventually they might break up. I was in that situation more often than I'd like to remember. I married the wrong person, I had toxic family relationships, and had no idea until I took Maya's program. So, the link for a free consultation is in the show notes, and I'm so happy to offer it all the podcast listeners. If you sign up for her program, you will get a free session worth $500 with Maya Diamond herself, one-on-one. That's just for How to Trust Your Intuition podcast listeners.
You bottle it up forever, and then it fucking explodes, and you feel vindicated. And you also feel like you delivered that information kind of shitty, but you still feel the same way. So I would go to my mom and I would say, listen, I still feel very strongly about what I expressed yesterday. However, you did not deserve to be spoken to in that way. And I should have never yelled and screamed at you. And for that, I am incredibly sorry. So you take back the delivery. You do not take back your stance. And that has now become the work that I do. Like, how do you have a relationship with someone who disapproves of you and say to them, I don't need you to approve of me because I approve of me. So whatever you need to carry, knock yourself out. But a lot of this comes full circle with emotional intelligence, being able to feel uncomfortable or saddened or dismissed and not go try to fix it. Right? Like sometimes that emotion is there. Emotions are always there, just as messaging. But that message right there could very well be, listen, being at odds with this person doesn't feel good. Maybe we need to reevaluate this relationship or what you share with this individual, if it's safe to share certain things with this individual. So yeah, so that's sort of the whole sordid tale of Dead Dad Makeup to Speak Up Coach.
I love that. I don't know if anyone else has that story.
I doubt it.
What I love the most, what I got from your story is, I think a lot of times when, as you said, especially introverts, but everyone bottling it up, not speaking out. And then when they do, you know, it's this vomit that could be, it could be inappropriate, right? It could be violent speak, or it could be shouting, or whatever. That's innate to being human. And it's okay to do that. But at the same time, you get to take ownership of it and you get to apologize, because we are all human. And I think that's something really important to highlight, because when you're sitting in that, I think for me too, when we're sitting in this position of like, I don't want to say anything, I don't want to say anything, our biggest fear is that we will scream and that we will be the person that we don't want to be. And we're fully human and we get to apologize. I wanted to say really quickly, with those friends that I had that experience with, I knew that they were loving, emotionally intelligent, safe people. And I was like, oh, I'm excited to have this healing conversation with them. And my background's extreme as well. And it was because of my emotional intelligence and just practicing these tools for a very long time, that when I was 41 and I was inside the family unit living with them, I realized that the issue wasn't me, and that they were not the type of people like my friends who could have this healing, healthy conversation. Tried for a long time. And what I did over and over again was kind of like you said, you're like, I don't subscribe to that. That's not who I am. I literally just over and over again to all of my family would say, all I'm asking is that you treat me as kind as you do in front of the neighbors as you do behind closed doors. That's all I'm asking for. And because it was not healthy relationships, and I think this is a lot of times what people fear, but and it's not as common, but their behavior would escalate, right? Like I wasn't engaging in the getting angry and yelling back and getting triggered. They would escalate, and I'd be like, okay, I hear you. Could you please just not yell at me, or could you please treat me with kindness? And over and over and over again, they got worse. I just have to say this, it's terrible, but it's also funny. I subscribe to the 4 agreements, right? And one of them is don't take anything personally. One of them's do your best. And so I because I knew there was sort of mental illness at this point going on, I wasn't taking anything personally. And I did send in a group text to my family, who was basically abusing me at that time. I was like, I don't take any of this personally. I'm just simply putting in this request. And then a few days later, I got a text from my mom, and it was this angry text. She's like, you say you're not taking any of this personally. Well, I am. And I think this is very personally, affronting to me. And I was just like, oh, right. And what wound up happening was we vibrated out. I wound up actually getting kicked out of all of the biological family. Of course, it was trauma in the traditional sense, but in the end, it is something that has really, really served me. There's nothing I could have done to have changed anyone in that system. And I also want to say, like, that's not most people's stories. Most people's stories are somewhere in between what you talked about with your mother and what I talked about with my friends. There's somewhere in between there where you're in alignment, or there's little things off and you get to repair it. Yeah. So thank you
Yeah.
for sharing that story.
Well, there's a couple things that you said, I think, that are really important to underline. And one of them is a concept that I have where I talk about when it comes to vulnerability, you speak your truth into ears that can hear you.
That's it.
Not all ears can hear you. And sadly, it's usually the ears we wish could hear us that we keep petitioning. We keep knocking on the door going like, Mom, when I share this news, are you going to get excited the way I wish you always did? Or are you going to go, oh, well, why didn't you get president then? Why'd you just get vice president? Why'd you get, oh, you got a 96? Where's the other 4 points? Right? Or like, why would you want to do that? Why would you, those are ears that cannot hear you. So I'm not talking about only speak your truth to people you can trust. I'm not saying that. I'm saying only share the most vulnerable pieces of your growth or who you are with people who can hold that. And that's such a great example of, you may not have agreed with these friends of yours, but you were able to reside in that place with so much mutual respect. Juxtaposed against the relationship with family, where it's wherever they are in their journey, they're not capable of being what I need. Now, here's the problem that usually happens. And this is when we start so much energy on the blame and how awful. We can size that up and recognize that it's not for us. So one of the examples that I use is like with dietary issues, like gluten, for example. If you eat gluten and it fucks your body up massively, you recognize, okay, I can't be around this specific energy in food form. It's better for me to stay away. But we don't then spend all of our time talking shit on gluten and like going off about it and being like carrying signs about how fucked up gluten is. We just stay away from it and work with the foods energetically that feel good to us. The same is true for humans. There's a lot more pain. There's a lot more abuse. There's a lot more trauma to get through with human beings. But it's not dissimilar energetically. It's recognizing, oh, wow, this is not congruent. And I can't thrive in this situation. You clearly aren't able to thrive here. I'm going to remove myself from this situation. And then what happens then, especially at the very, very beginning, is you usually have what I call dichotomous emotion, where you have two very opposing forces. So on one side, you are so fucking proud of yourself for bounding up. And then on the other side, you are racked with grief or sadness or disappointment or overwhelm or obligation. And it's being with both of those things at the same time that builds resilience. And so you have to do it over and over and over again. That's the thing. Like sometimes people, my clients will say, how do you just rattle this stuff off? I'm like, well, I've been doing this for 15 years and I talk about this nonstop. It is literally a rehearsal. So if there's stuff that you don't know, write it out and fucking rehearse it. Stand in front of the mirror and rehearse it. And if you have difficult conversations that you have to go into, I tell people all the time, write it out, take it with you to the conversation.
I did. I had a whole notebook with 15 points on it when I went to talk to my friends.
And say this if you show up there with your iPad or your notebook or whatever, say, listen, I know this seems, if you feel weird about it, if you feel weird about having a script showing up to a meeting or a conversation, say this. I know this probably seems silly that I wrote stuff down, but this means so much to me. And I honestly really wanted to get it right. And I didn't want to go rogue and fly off the handle. I wanted to really make sure I was giving you the grace that you deserved, right? Something like that. Like it just mattered to me.
Yep. I felt a little more people pleasing about it. Like, if I were in their shoes and I came to them with a 15-point bullet list in a notebook, I would be like, so that was more of a like setting up of like, I came away with our conversation with more questions than answers. So Perfect. I wrote it out and I just have some things I really want to understand from your perspective. And, again, they are emotionally intelligent and healthy people, so they got it. But I literally teach the same things. I wanted to come back really quick to the gluten and
Yes.
people example. I think that's a very illustrative example. Something, and again, with diction and using words, the thing that helped me a lot was coming up with the word discernment versus judgment.
Yes.
And so a lot of times, even today at 43, initially the discernment will come in as judgment because my body will take it in. It's like, that's not for me. It goes right up to the head. And it's like, how can those people, like, really quick? And then I'm like, oh, wait a minute. No, I don't need to have a whole podcast about how gluten sucks.
Yes. Yes, that's right.
I can just discern that they can go do what they want to do. And that is actually in alignment with the essence of who I am.
Yes.
And I just keep rewiring those thoughts over and over again. It's like, if people want to do that thing that I would never do, that's okay. Like, they can go do that. I'm just discerning I don't want to be around gluten. So I think a lot of times that word discernment is missing from a lot of people's lexicon. And I think that can be really, really helpful.
Well, yeah, something that you mentioned a little bit earlier, and I think this is a perfect example, is my only caveat with what you were sharing there is if there is extreme emotional reaction. So let's say you just saw a text that pissed you the fuck off, and maybe there's that judgment that comes in. This is my suggestion. If the emotion is really potent, then it probably deserves some sort of processing. So I call these emotional releases. Sometimes they're anger, sometimes they're anxiety, sometimes they're overwhelm, sometimes they're sadness. But there's a ton of ways that you can process emotion without doing damage to a relationship.
Yes.
So when we were talking earlier about, how it really is counterintuitive to quell anger. Like our anger response is rooted in fight flight. Right? It's rooted in our primitive behavioral tactic to keep ourselves safe. So when we feel a sense of threat from a spouse, from a bestie, from a family member, getting angry is totally intuitive. However, it very, very rarely yields the results you want in the relationship. So what I suggest to people is, if you notice that you have this heightened emotional response, either engaging with somebody or even just receiving a text or an email, do whatever you need to do to process that emotion, whether it's doing primal screams, beating up your bed, ripping up a bunch of papers, scribbling, breaking things safely, silent screams, rage rooms. There's all sorts of different things that you can do, but get that out first, then tackle that discernment. Then look at, like, okay, I understand. Oh, I was triggered because that's exactly what my mom would say.
Yep.
Or that reminds me so much of what my brother used to do to me, and that just spiraled me out of it. So I find that I need room to get to the discernment by processing what's happening emotionally with me.
I 100% agree.
So take your time. And I've done this recently with my best friend, where I'm like, I want to make sure that I'm looking at my role in the matter, and I'm not just jumping to defensiveness. So I need to process this a little bit before I retort. Yes. And I think but being vocal about that instead of just ghosting someone.
Yeah.
You know what I mean?
Yep. Yeah. That was a natural, nice pause I had with my friends, because the very next day I said, I'd like to revisit this, but my friend was a little bit sick and they were also busy. So it was 2 weeks time that we had in between it. And for me, because I was very much triggered. I mean, without trying, they actually were coercing me, right? Like, they're not narcissists. They're not toxic people. They were not trying to cause harm. In fact, they were trying to heal, right? And that was really upsetting to me. And so the longer those 2 weeks went by, and then on top of that, also, we just had this cute little exchange where I found their keys and they were just about to ask me to look for their keys. And I didn't know it was their keys. And I saw it and I was like, I'm just going to put them in their mailbox. And so then, like, I called up my friend and he's like, you have no idea. For 24 hours, we're going to call Betsy because she finds everything. And then all of a sudden we get a text that they're in our mailbox. And it was just like this nice little, like, not repair, but just like more bonding of like, we can have this little bit of conflict and the trigger is sort of going down. And then it's like, oh, a reminder, like these people I already knew, but it sort of boosted that bond. So I agree. And I am one of the type of people that before I was like, let's get this conflict banged out right away because I don't like being uncomfortable. But I do agree with that. Well, let's get into our questions because I mean, I think like this has just been fun. I mean, we could literally, when you're like, without going down this Bible rabbit hole, it's like, no, I really want to go down that Bible rabbit hole, but we won't. We won't. We'll be discerning. So we've got the 3 questions. Let's take the first one. How, when, what was the process of you learning your intuition, trusting it, that kind of thing?
Yeah. Well, I think that anecdote that I shared with you about my dad's passing was one of the most pivotal. I think up until that time, one of the biggest shifts that happened for me was meeting my husband. And so I met him when I was 18. And when we first got together, it was, I need you to go to these church engagements with my dad. And like, I have since apologized to him for many of those things. But I think in, oh my gosh, I just lost my train of thought. You gotta.
Oh, that's all right. We were talking about the makeup situation with your mom and
how I learned it. How I learned. Yes. So I think with meeting him, there were a bunch of things that I was exposed to that were always painted as very black and white. For example, if you smoke weed, it's a gateway drug. You'll eventually do heroin or something like that. And then you'll drop out of school. You can't run businesses. You're going to, it was very extreme. If you drink, you're going to become an alcoholic. If you gamble, you're going to lose all of your money. I mean, it was so extreme. And so I started experiencing all of those things with him, like having some wine or having some weed or, going to Vegas. And I'm like, oh shit. And that was the beginning of it all shifting because I felt unbelievably lied to. So I was furious. I was like, how dare you tell me that this is always the result and leave no room for nuance? Fuck all y'all. And so that was probably one of the biggest shifts. And then when my dad passed as well, that was another huge shift of listening to intuition.
Those are beautiful examples. Those are really, really beautiful examples. I mean, I grew up with the same programming as well with all that stuff. Okay, can you talk about a time when you didn't trust your intuition and what happened as a result? When you didn't follow what your intuition said?
Gosh, well, I'm sort of in the ramifications of it right now. I am working through some stuff with a friendship that has me a little like, how the fuck did this sneak by me? So I'm noticing that it's been a bunch of micro infractions throughout, 13, 15 years of our friendship of me going, that's not that serious. That's not that big of a deal, or that I'm just going to let it go. And when I think back to it, there's a huge piece of me that feels like because we were in different places and still tend to be different places, I give her more grace for not being what I need.
Yep.
And I have recently started to see things through a much different light, experiencing other friendships, etc., where I'm like, oh, wow, that stuff was really problematic. And I haven't been getting my needs met in this relationship. But we're not mean to each other. We're not awful. She's really fun. We have a blast together. So it really snuck up on me. So I'm seeing now, even though we've had so many conversations and so much stuff that we've worked through, that it almost felt too laborious to tackle every last little thing. So I let myself off the hook a little bit. And now I'm seeing sort of okay, we need to reevaluate. And I'm not exactly sure what that's going to look like right now. But I do feel very strongly that we both have a lot of respect and courtesy and kindness for each other, that it's will be, if it is an uncoupling, it will be very conscious and deliberate and kind And if it's not, I think it'll be life-giving. So
Right.
we'll see.
I mean, there's always the other option of just maybe not bestie, but like
Right.
one
Yes.
or two out in the bullseye, right? Like, well,
That's
we
right.
can still have fun, but I'm not going to rely on you for these intimate things. I found in my
Yeah.
own friendships very recently that it's almost like when you were talking about, oh, I met my husband and I got exposed to all these different things. And it's like my standards got higher because I got more exposed. I'm looking at my friendships and being like, oh, wow, like we're not as an alignment, very similar as I thought we were. And I was giving them more room. But I'm like, I also didn't know any different at the time. Like these were the
Yes.
best that I had at the time, and they
Yes.
were amazing. And I put them up on that appropriate pedestal of like, these people are amazing. And it's like, again, it's just discernment. It's just like, well, I'm not into the same type of things that they are, or whatever. So that's a really great example. And I love how you're sort of sitting in the I don't really know moment. That's it's high emotional intelligence, I have to say.
Oh, it's painful as fuck, but
Yes. Yes,
sometimes I'm like, I wish I didn't see this as clearly as I do, you know?
Yeah. Oh yeah, because you miss what you had. And like, you know, what did they say? Like,
Ignorance is bliss.
yes, thank you. Thank you. I couldn't remember ignorance. Okay, so how about a time when you trusted your intuition, perhaps despite logic or evidence supporting it? Could be big or small, or in between.
Gosh. Oh, I know. And I have yet to see how this is going to play out. But here's what I'll also say, and I'm sure this is something you talk about, but once you start working on honing the intuition, it just keeps getting stronger and stronger and stronger. Like it gets yoked, right? And so now I'm at a point where it's no longer a really quiet whisper. It's like, bitch, pay attention, you know? And even though it's soft and it's kind and enveloped in care, I feel like it's banging on the door now, like where I'm just not able to ignore it anymore. And so recently I've been feeling like there's a shift that's coming to my work and I'm not sure what it is. And I'm playing around with a bunch of different elements and I'm not sure. But what is crystal clear is that I needed a break from my podcast. I've been doing it for over 10 years. And I'm burnt on the logistics of the podcast. I love having conversations, but all the businessy stuff that goes into it, I'm just burnt the fuck out. And so I decided to take the rest of April and May and possibly June off of the show. And it was like, like my heart cracked open. I felt so much relief. When I left the announcement for my podcast, I was kind of like, oh, yes. And it was such a perfect example of like, okay, it's really clear. I don't think it's always super clear. I think there are sometimes multiple paths. I've had situations where my intuition is like, oh, I don't know about this. Like I've had this recently with a student. And I was like, oh, and she blew me away. And she's been like the best. So I have to remember like, okay, sometimes there's multiple right answers. If I would have shut that shit down then, that might have been fine too. Who knows?
Yep. Yeah.
But giving yourself the freedom to course correct, I think that is one of the biggest things. So many of us feel like, well, I've never spoken up before. I can't just start speaking up now. Or I've never told him that before. I can't just start telling him now. I'm like, yes, you fucking can.
Yeah.
Yes, you can. And here's what it sounds like, you know? I call it declaring the do-over. But yeah, course correct the fuck out of it. Like, it's okay.
Yeah. It's such a beautiful illustration of like when you finally let it go temporarily, who knows where it's going, that everything's been lifted. My heart is open. That's a big one. I mean, it is a little bit of a breakup with a podcast or a temporary hold, but in romantic relationships, you can even take a 3-day vacation from it. You don't tell your partner, I'm taking a 3-day vacation from you, but you'd be like, oh, I'm going to see my sister or my friend. I'm going to a cabin by myself for the weekend, which might be a really big step for you advocating for yourself. But if you step away and you're able to imagine what your life is like when you end it, and that's the feeling that you get, it's like, psh, before I even knew what intuition was, that's one of the things that happened to me. I was getting a terrible stomach ache. And then I broke up with the guy and I was like, what? I'm walking on air. So yeah.
That's so weird that you brought that up, because I've been talking with a couple of my students about that. I cannot tell you how many women I have seen who are in, a heterosexual relationship where once they leave the marriage, they all of a sudden don't have anxiety. And they'll try herbs and they'll try acupuncture and they'll try anything for the anxiety. And I'm like, you got to get rid of that relationship. Yeah. That's your gluten, my friend.
Yes. Yep.
Yeah.
And I think that's a really good, maybe sort of wrap up. And you were talking about, the body and all of this. It's like I guess we started talking about this before we started recording, but loving the neuroscience, which is like my favorite course, the course that I got an A in college. Like, I love that stuff. And I think luckily it is starting to infiltrate the medical field, the mind-body connection. When I got into a different relationship, all of a sudden I got terrible lower back pains, which I'd never had before, never had since. And no practitioner, even the energy practitioners that I went to, said, what's going on in the rest of your life? Like, it was literally my body saying, get the fuck out of there.
Yeah.
But, instead I married the guy. So,
you did the cognitive override. Yeah. But again, sometimes we don't know until we know. And that's the other thing too, is if you are an empathic, big-hearted, generous person, we're rooting for the other people.
Yes.
We're not rooting for that dude to come back as a total narcissist or as somebody who is actually abusive or not emotionally available. We root for those little moments when we see some hope or some potential, but how it was at the very beginning. It's the same way none of us develop the belief that we're not enough for the fuck of it. Like, it happens without really our consent. There's a part of us that is just genuinely wants that person to come through for us. So I think there's some comfort in knowing, like, I really fought for him because I have the capability of seeing good in people.
Yeah.
And when I was no longer able to see that good, I was able to make that choice for myself. But I think there's not enough credit given to us that we see good in people or we see potential. I don't think it's a good reason to stay.
Right.
But I also find that to be a lot more encouraging than, what the fuck is wrong with you? Your picker is off. You picked the wrong people. You. Like, well, let's talk about parents and their influence. And
yeah, well, what I've learned is just make sure that you're with someone who roots for you as much as you root for them. For me, it was always like, well, this is how I would want someone else to treat me.
Yeah.
So that golden rule. So like, if I were acting this way, I'd want someone to act this way. And it's that discernment of like, make sure you're with people who can hear you, who support you. That's just a really good ending. So I want to ask you where people can find you and what they would come to you for specifically.
Yes. So usually where it hurts the most when people come to work with me is either in like a self-worth area of, I know I'm not living up to my potential in my work because I have imposter complex. That's a self-worth thing. That's not believing in your own enoughness. Or very commonly, there's something in some sort of a relationship. Sometimes it's parental, like older parents that you're caretaking for, or adult children, or workplace partnerships, all sorts of different things where
all
there's
the easy stuff.
Really, yeah. It hurts there, and you're trying to figure out, what am I doing to allow this? So I'll give you a perfect avatar. I had a client, I think she came to me probably in 2020 or 2019, maybe. And her whole goal was to get her husband to love her again. And I was like, full stop. We can't control other people. Like, nope. I said, what I can help you do though, is I can help you love yourself so much that you make the most powerful choices for yourself. Now, she is very, very happily divorced. in a new relationship. Her work is thriving. She is so fucking confident. And we laugh about it now. She's like, remember when that was my goal? To get other people to love me? And that's where and so we continue to peel the layers of the onion. Now things are showing up in a more elevated, evolved way. And so we work through it at the next level, right? But that's such a perfect example of, we think it's always the new job or the new partner, or if I was just thinner, or we think it's all these things externally, but it's really not. Yeah. It's really, really not. So if you want to come hang out, you can find me over at amygreensmith.com. And I always say that all of those names are spelled like just the basic bitch way. Amy Green Smith. I didn't get any fancy, sexy names. And I have a podcast that has almost 500 episodes that you can certainly cruise back through. The first 8 years, my husband was my sidekick. So that's really kind of fun to hear his dynamic as well. But I've got free hypnosis over there, free workbooks, all sorts of stuff that you can jump in on. And then as far as social, I hang out the most on Instagram, like any self-respecting Gen Xer. So come over and say hi. I'm under the handle, Hey, Amy Green Smith.
Yay. This was an absolute pleasure. I've enjoyed this so much. Thank you so much for being here.
Oh my gosh. Likewise. It was such a blast. And thank you for letting me for having me.
I hope you learned a lot about yourself and how to communicate your authentic self with humor to others from our interview. I wanted to pop in and share that we're going to have a 2-week break coming up. So that doesn't mean that you're not going to hear from us, though. Over the years, there have been 2 specific women, and I'm talking about like over 10 to 15 years, 2 specific women and their platform, their generosity, their sisterhood that has really allowed me to keep my business flowing and growing, and sometimes just afloat, to be honest. So we're going to be airing some replays of some really popular episodes having to do with these 2 women. So tune in on June 5th and 12th for those. And we'll be back with new episodes, new interviews in season 6 on June 19th.
How to Trust Your Intuition, the podcast, is written, produced, and created by me, your host, Betsy LaFay. Music provided by Ben Talmy. If you don't want to be like that pilot that is 80% sure you'll get to your next destination safely, and you want to take the right class to learn the right language, and guess what? Intuition is a language. Head over to howtotrustyourintuition.com. I hope this podcast has been helpful to you. If it has, please forward it to a friend who you think it could also make a difference for. There's something that you can do for me and everyone else who listens to this podcast as well. If you hit subscribe, you'll never miss another episode. It'll also help the show get to other people. And of course, I know you've heard other podcast hosts say this before, but it's totally true. If you leave us a 5-star rating and a review, it helps other people like you discover this podcast. We all need to learn to trust our intuition. So, hit subscribe, give us a 5-star review, and write a little blurb while you're there. Your intuition will thank you.